Welcome to the third week, guys. This week we have shorter lecture schedule because of the test that you guys will be taking. So yay, that's exciting, I'm sure. We're going to be talking about the Roaring Twenties today, and then we'll follow that with the unfortunate event that ended the Roaring Twenties, and that is the crash, the Great Depression, or the beginning of the Great Depression, rather, that occurred in October of 1929. But this lecture's happy. The next lecture, not so happy as we get into that. So the Roaring Twenties is a nickname commonly given to the 1920s, although really, if we're honest about it, we could actually say that it really began in 1919 as the American soldiers were coming back from Europe, and then we could say it actually ended in 1929 because the stock market crashed and there was a lot of bad things that happened that year. So the exciting part, the roaring part of the 1920s ended in 1929. So it's kind of a decade. There's a little bit of wiggle room on either side there. But it's called the Roaring Twenties because it's exciting. It's a party. That's kind of the idea. It's the roar of the party, the people talking, having a good time. That's kind of the idea behind the Roaring Twenties. And it's generally a very positive period during American history. There's a lot of changes that are going to occur, and that's primarily what we're going to be talking about today. Is the changes that occur in the United States. Although you might not actually think from the very first kind of thoughts that you hear about the Roaring Twenties that there was a lot of change. In fact, the president after World War I, Warren Harding, who beat Woodrow Wilson in the 1920 presidential election, famously campaigned on a program of normalcy. Okay, that was his word. He coined it. And he basically said, look, if you elect me, I'm going to return America to normal. Now, the question is, of course, what is normal? What does he mean by normal? Well, in his case, what he means by normal is he wants to revoke, repeal the things that Woodrow Wilson and his government had done for the last 8 years. Now, two things about that. Number one, that couldn't be done. And this is an unfortunate thing about government. So be careful once you become a voter about this. But typically, once the government takes some power or takes some responsibility, it really struggles to give it up. And despite the best efforts of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover in their early years, Herbert Hoover's early years, I should say, really there's not a lot of rollback on the government. The government stays big, just like it was under Woodrow Wilson. And the reason for this is people get hired and then they get lots of money, and then it's really hard to give up all that extra money. For example, Woodrow Wilson instituted an income tax. So this greatly raises the level of income for the federal government. Think about it. A vast majority of modern United States funds comes from the income tax. What you make working, the government takes part of that. They didn't do that before World War One. That was a war measure to help pay for the war. And I think in that case, I can understand why the government might do that. But then after the war, of course, everybody's getting paid by that income tax. So the government doesn't want to repeal that, as we can probably guess. But most people in the United States, in fact, a large majority, 60 to 70%, agreed with Warren G. Harding, and they wanted to return to normal because there was a lot of scandals in Woodrow Wilson's political career after the war. In fact, you could even say during the war, but really the press of the United States was actually controlled. And you guys might remember when we talked about the German Americans during World War One, the government issued and used unheard of powers. In fact, I would go so far as to say powers that they have never again used in the history of the United States to silence freedom of speech. Specifically, they could control newspapers. They could say, nope, you cannot publish this because it would bring down people's confidence in the government. Not this information is wrong, not would you please not put this forward, but no, if you put this, people might not be confident in us. So this is something that we would more closely associate with a communist press or a fascist Nazi press, not the American press. So this is going on during World War I. So there may have been disagreement, there may have been frustration with Woodrow Wilson's rule, but really we don't see much of it until 1918 when he decides to remove those restrictions on the presses, and finally people can talk about whether they're happy or not with the government. And it turns out that most people weren't. So in the 1920 election, we have a return of Republican rule. So you'll remember that Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were Republicans. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was a Democrat, won 2 terms in a row. But then Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover are all Republicans. So remember, that generally follows the trend from the 1860s, where we've had primarily Republican presidents. The only exception to that being Grover Cleveland and then Woodrow Wilson. Now we've got 3 more Republican presidents. That idea, that trend will kind of reverse course for the next period of American history, but we're not getting there quite yet. But again, the Republicans are back. So the idea is the Republicans are back in charge. Things are going to return to the way they were beforehand. There's this idea that the government will again be small. Okay, the government will again go back to being a smaller size. In fact, current estimates are that Woodrow Wilson increased the size of the federal government by about a factor of 10. So like times 10. That's how much the government increased under Woodrow Wilson during the war. And the general idea from the Republicans was they were going to reduce the size of the government. And they did, but we're not talking cut it in, divided it by 10. They reduced it by maybe 10%. Okay, so they can't really dial it back. And nor do I think the Republicans actually wanted to do so, but it campaigned well. So they said, yeah, we're going to cut the government back. And they didn't really do it. They also promised to intervene a lot less in American affairs. And in this, they actually did much better with one exception. And we'll get to that as we talk about the cultural changes that occurred in the 1920s. But as far as interference in businesses and certainly in newspapers and things like that, the government does get much better. And this is for 2 reasons. Number one, they repealed the laws that Woodrow Wilson had passed to allow his government to do those kind of things. And number two, again, this was a campaign promise they were able to keep. They said, kind of get our hands out of the information business. We won't put as many requirements on people as you did during the war. And I think that's a good thing. And it's one of the reasons that the Roaring '20s is going to be such a good growth period for the U.S. The government kind of takes its hands off and allows the American economy to do what it's going to do. And I think that's a good thing. Another thing that characterizes the political scene in the 1920s is a withdrawal from international politics. So obviously during World War I, the United States had for the first time really in its history engaged with the world. They'd gotten involved in the war in the Middle East. Woodrow Wilson had been a leading figure in the peace process. The United States had gotten involved in the Middle East, and it had gotten further involved in Asia in places like China and Japan. It had taken on this role of a world leader, one that Woodrow Wilson really desired for the United States to take. The problem was that, as we've talked about in class before, the sense of isolation or the desire for isolation from the world community is still quite strong in the United States. So starting in 1919, the U.S. attempts to distance itself from the rest of the world, intervening less. It does not join the League of Nations, the alliance system kind of created after World War I to keep the peace that failed spectacularly, by the way. But you could say one of the reasons that it failed was because the United States didn't join it. So it's kind of what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did the League of Nations fail because the U.S. didn't join it, or did the U.S. not join it because they knew the League was going to fail? It's kind of a circular question. Who knows what the right answer is? Another thing that we notice is that America kind of pulls away from its immigrant past, which is really kind of ironic because the last period of American history, as we've talked about, saw an unparalleled increase in immigrants coming across from Northern and Southern Europe and from Asia as well, as we talked about. And in the 1920s, there's actually a distinct pushback against this. Specifically, some groups that are targeted are certainly Asians, certainly Catholics as well, as we've talked about in the past. And so the United States by 1924 actually puts a very strict quota limit on each country. So for example, let's just pick Norway as an example. There might be 50,000 people that can immigrate each year into the United States from Norway. Now, I don't think there were that many Norwegians trying to get into the country. There were some, but I don't think there was 50,000, which pretty much meant that every single Norwegian that wanted to come and live in the United States could get in, no problem. But another nation that we say didn't like so much, or the American people at the time didn't like so much, say, let's just pick one and say Yugoslavia, which existed at that time. Maybe we don't want Yugoslavians for some reason. They tend to be Catholic. They have a kind of more socialistic outlook on things. We don't want them. And so we're only going to make a quota of 500 people. Okay, so the government basically sets quotas on every individual country, and that's the amount of people that can get in from that country every year. So certain countries have huge, unmeetable quotas. Like infinite amount of people from Norway can basically immigrate, and then very, very small quotas, and we're only going to accept the absolute best of the best, the people that we really want from some countries. So how that works out, it depends on what the United States felt about that nation. So we kind of see a withdrawal from the international community. The United States goes back to looking primarily towards its own interests. And it's going to stay that way, by the way, until World War II, when the United States will re-engage with the rest of the world, and they stay engaged with the rest of the world. And of course, we'll talk about that when we get to that. Another thing the Roaring Twenties should be of interest to us for is because of the technological revolution that occurs for the average American. Okay, we don't normally talk about the 1920s as a technological revolution. It's not as if a lot of new technologies debut in the 1920s, but they get into the hands of consumers, and this includes in transportation, mass communication, and even your average appliances. So the average life of the American is going to change. Let's talk about that. So number one, in the 1920s, this is the decade where a majority of American households are going to own an automobile. And that is a massive change from previously. And again, as people that live in 2020, we probably don't even understand how radical of a change this is. Maybe we do because we're stuck inside these last couple weeks. But this is a massive change for people. Remember that your entire life, where you could reasonably go, was pretty much limited to a walking distance around you. And that was true, by the way, for most of human history. You probably didn't want to go much more than 5 to 10 miles away from your house. Even 10 miles, if you've walked 10 miles before, it usually takes, if you're just walking, the better part of 3 hours. And that's 3 hours there, 3 hours back. That is a long trip. Now, there are some ways to get around a little faster. Maybe your family owns a horse. Okay, you've got a little bit more room. Maybe you've got a cart. It doesn't really give you more distance, but you can take goods from place to place. Maybe your town is lucky enough to have a train. That certainly was true in a lot of American cities. But the automobile really changes that, because now somebody can jump in their car and they can reasonably drive 20, 30, 40 miles away and come back in the same day. They can bring goods with them. They can bring recreational equipment. You can take your canoe with you somewhere. You can go get groceries. You can bring them back to your house. It really is transformative on American lives. And especially as more roads are created, since more people have automobiles, it becomes possible to go visit people that live in other places. Now if grandma lives 50 miles away from you, you might be able to see her every once in a while, rather than basically having to plan an entire trip and get on the train and try and connect with her somehow. You can just drive over there in your car. It's a big fundamental change. Another technology that really begins to come into its own during the 1920s is the airplane. The airplane had been, of course, invented in 1903 by the Wright brothers, but obviously, if you've ever seen that airplane, it's not one that you probably wanted to ride on long distance. And in fact, the one flown in 1903 could not fly very far. I mean, it could only fly a couple thousand feet at the most. But by the 1920s, we actually have the beginning of passenger airlines. We have planes that can fly passengers from coast to coast. Now, this isn't occurring in huge numbers. It's not as if people are flying, to the other side of the country for a weekend, but it is possible to fly places. This opens up new settlement in Alaska. This opens up the ability for businessmen to connect from New York to Los Angeles, for example, and continues to increase the connections across the country. And really, this is an important thing. And of course, there's several important airplane feats completed in the 1920s, the most famous of which is probably Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. And of course, if you're one of my students and we get back to school, you should ask me about my newspaper, where I actually have the Detroit Press talking about Charles Lindbergh making it back. And there's a parade held in his honor here in Detroit. I've got that newspaper if you want to take a look at it. It's really cool, from almost 100 years ago now. We also have a revolution in mass communication. What is mass communication? Well, mass communication is how we talk to millions of people at once. And there's two really big things that are developed in the 1920s that affect this. The first is radio, which is the wireless transmission through radio waves, which is a form of light. It's complicated. Ask your science teacher if you don't know how that works. That can basically transmit information, and specifically for most people's purposes, it transmits sound. So you have a environment where you can now transmit voices, you can transmit shows, you can even transmit music to people wherever they live, and they can just dial in their receiver and they can hear what you're saying. Again, the radar was not invented in the 1920s, but most American families began to buy radar or radio, excuse me. Radar is a different technology. If I've been saying radar the entire time, I apologize. I meant radio. Radar is a very similar but different technology. It fires off those same radio waves, and it's trying to bounce them off something. And when it gets a bounce back beam, it knows something's there. So if you've seen the old World War II movies, they've kind of got that like wave going around a circle, and it's got the dots that blip and they usually move. That's the radio waves bouncing back. Anyway, that's radar. We're talking about radio. So radio allows people to listen to transmissions from a long way away, sometimes as far as hundreds of miles. There is interference, so they're not infinite range, but they are pretty long distance. And this allows people to listen to shows. Radio shows become popular, humor shows, dramatic shows, and things like that. There's a very famous, though this didn't happen in the 1920s, but just as an illustration, an anecdote, there's a very famous showing or airing of War of the Worlds, which is a book by H.G. Wells about the invasion of Earth by Martians. And people in New Jersey thought they were actually being attacked by Martians because they were hearing this over the radio. So it's this mass communication technology. It's really cool. It's not really used politically in the 1920s, but FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's going to use it to deliver a bunch of really famous speeches, which are still available. You can actually listen to them on YouTube. And I highly recommend that you do. They're called his fireside chats, and he delivered these over radio to the American people. So people would sit around their living room and listen to their president speak. And this was totally new. And that technology was widely available in the 1920s. Another thing that you might personally really like, I know a lot of teenagers like this, I certainly like these, is moving pictures. And we would think of those as the movies. People would go to a theater, a huge building that would have a projector and a big screen, and they would play movies. Most of these were silent movies. Sound and recordings hadn't been invented yet. So you'd have the action, and then you'd kind of have these placards up there that would say, this is what happened, or this is the line of dialogue. You would often have live music in the theater because, of course, there's no sound. So, you have live music as people run around and do all these funny things. But obviously, that technology continues to get more and more advanced until eventually in the 1930s and 1940s, we begin to have sound. And eventually we will have wireless transmission of movie pictures, which occurs in the 1950s and 1960s, which is, of course, called television, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In fact, you probably had an opportunity to watch a bunch of television while we're on quarantine here. And you probably haven't got to go see a lot of movies since all the theaters are closed. But that technology is important. And it does bring people together. We kind of think as movies as a very singular experience. At least I do. Like I go with my wife, or I go with my brother, I go with my family, and we watch the movie. Even though there's other people around us, we're watching it with whoever we're with, and we walk out, right? But actually, back in the 1920s, it was almost a social event. Everybody came together. They watched the newest movie, or they watched something that was more akin to the news. This was the only screen in town, and so if anybody wanted to make anything visual, they would oftentimes, show it on these movie screens. And so in many ways, it kind of brought the community together and let them see things. We also have a cultural revolution during the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, and let's talk about that as well. A couple really important things. Number one, the 1920s is when we finally have universal suffrage in the United States. And suffrage, for those of you who don't remember that term, is basically the right to vote. And so by universal suffrage, that means that almost everybody has the right to vote. Specifically, the group that had been excluded up until this point is women. Okay, and women had been mounting a campaign really since the 1890s to get the vote. And one of their leading arguments was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, these amendments guaranteeing Black men the right to vote. They said, wait a second, how is it that men are given the right to vote? And in fact, the Constitution goes so far as to give a certain type of man protections and his rights to vote, which, by the way, rightly so. No one was arguing that they shouldn't get those rights. But they're saying, look, there's these specific protections for this group of the population, We want those protections and guarantees for ourselves as well. And that movement, you'll remember, I think we talked about this in class, really occurred from west to east in the United States, because many of those Western states were rough, tough. The women out there had to fend for themselves because, again, they're far from civilization. Your husband dies, you're out there with a bunch of children and a farm, and you're going to have to maintain it anyway. So most of those Western states came into the Union with equal rights, came into the Union with women being able to vote. And slowly over the next 30 years or so, that idea kind of spread from west to east. And finally, in 1920, with the passing of the 19th Amendment, we have women allowed to vote from a federal perspective. So they'd been allowed to vote in the states, but now they're allowed to vote from the federal perspective. And this is a good thing, right? More people are voting, more people are involved in the democracy. A really positive change. In fact, one of the other big changes I want to talk about is actually women being able to come outside of the home. I mentioned appliances earlier when we talked about technology, but I saved them till now because I want you to think about why the appliances are connected to women being outside the home. Some of the appliances that became widespread in the 1920s would include things like gas and electric stoves, or ranges, as you might hear them called. We have things like washing machines. We have things like vacuums. And basically, what all of these things do is they take the traditional roles and jobs that women did in most households, and they significantly improved women's ability to do these things and do them quickly. For example, if you've ever seen an old washing board, imagine having to do a big pile of laundry by hand. It takes hours and hours and hours, and it's incredibly physically demanding, as opposed to a washing machine where you just need to dump the clothes in, put some soap in it, and turn it on. This is a complete game changer for women, and this is going to allow them to go and possibly work a job. This increases a lot in the 1920s. It allows them to go out and have some personal freedom, go spend time with their friends, go visit their family, go just out and treat themselves. This really wasn't an option before these time-saving devices were created, because these women would have to work day in, day out, trying to maintain their homes, keep things clean. Now, that doesn't mean that women necessarily should have been doing those roles, but that was the tradition. That's what they were doing. And so these devices, by saving them time, allow women to enjoy going out of the home more often. And we see this a lot in the 1920s. The most famous kind of look of the 1920s is called the flapper style, where women are starting to wear shorter skirts and wearing their hair differently from women of earlier times. And this is reflective of that fact that they're out more. They have an opportunity to show off. They have an opportunity to go out and be with their friends more often. And it does come with some what we might call negative side effects, right? There's increase in divorce rates, and there's increase in other things that are going on. But in general, this is also a good thing, because women are able to go out and spend their time the way they want to spend it, rather than working all of the time. They're kind of getting some of the benefits that men had been enjoying from a work perspective. Men's jobs had been getting easier because of automation, right? You no longer have to physically press down objects. You've got these huge hydraulic machines that can do it for you, increasing people's efficiency at work. Now at home, we have increased efficiency as well, which allows these women to go spend their energy in other places. Really good thing that can't be overstated. Another thing that's famous about the Roaring Twenties, and I wish we had more time or a different medium to talk about it, and that is the music style jazz. You're probably familiar with jazz. If you don't know what jazz is, just type into YouTube jazz and listen to some jazz so you're familiar with it. It's a very interesting style. One of the things it's most famous for is its syncopated rhythm. Okay, so it's not got a regular rhythm. It's kind of got this irregular rhythm going on. And most jazz music is improvisational. So if you're not a musician, improvisational means it's kind of made up on the spot. There might be some general ideas of where the song's going, but the musicians kind of do their own thing, and they create this really intricate and complex music that's really exciting. It leads to a lot of different types of dancing, and it leads to some absolutely skilled musicians coming out, especially in the African American community. The African American community really reaches the big scene of the music world through jazz, and many of these famous singers and trumpet players and saxophone players really do well for themselves. And that's a whole nother topic I wish I had time to get into. Things that sometimes are called the Harlem Renaissance, where that's going on in New York in the African American community, and jazz is really bringing communities together. It's really cool. I can't do it any justice because this is YouTube and I can't play any jazz. So to talk about jazz without being able to play it is kind of silly. So I'll leave that up to you. If you want to go research that more, please go do it. It's definitely worth your time if you like music. Finally, let's talk about some society revolutions. And I've put this at the end because it's directly going to lead us into our next lecture. So one of the most important things to grasp about the 1920s is the reason that people were going to enjoy all of this great stuff, all of this partying and appliances and new cars and owning homes and all of these things that Americans are going to be doing is because a new way of paying for all of these things was being widely used as well. Again, this is not a new thing, but it became much more prevalent during the 1920s, and that was a reliance on credit. So for those of you not familiar with that, basically what you would do is you would go to the bank and you would borrow money, and you would go and you would take that money to purchase things. You're probably familiar with this with your parents' home. Obviously, they probably didn't cough up the entire amount of money. They borrowed it from the bank, and they're paying the bank back for that loan, and there's interest rates, and this isn't economics, so we won't go into that stuff. Now, Americans in the 1920s were able to get loans at dirt cheap prices, and they were able to get very small loans. Because normally today, if you go to the bank and you ask for a loan, it's usually a pretty significant sum. There's a lot of paperwork involved. They look at your credit score and this, that, and the other thing. Can I tell you that one of the reasons they do all that stuff is because of the 1920s? In the 1920s, you could pretty much go to the bank and ask for any size loan for any reason. You wanted a new refrigerator, which, by the way, total game changer. You don't have to prepare your food every day. You can save it. Wow, big change. But you wanted a refrigerator and you couldn't afford to buy a new refrigerator, but you could certainly afford monthly payments for it. And so you would go to the bank, you would take out a loan, and you would buy that refrigerator, and you would pay the bank back over time. And on one level, from an economic perspective, that's not that bad of a thing. In fact, borrowing and loans is one of the ways to create wealth in an economy, and it can work out. The problem is that credit and buying with credit becomes absolutely all over the place. And the danger is if somebody can't pay. Okay, if somebody can't pay off a loan, then the person that gave them the money has to get that money somehow. Okay, they don't just give it to them because they're nice. They might go out of business if that happens. So typically we say that they have to repossess something. Okay, so if you take out a loan for a fridge and you can't pay the monthly payments, that company has to take that fridge and it has to try and sell it, or it can sue you for damages and this, that, and the other thing. There's a lot of options, but it can't just let you take the money. It has to get the money back out of you somehow. And this is called risk. All right, there's always the risk that you won't pay. And the thing is that your fridge or your house or your car is not usually as valuable as just being repaid would be, because the business that gave you the loan, the bank that gave you the loan, has to sell the house, has to sell the car, has to sell the fridge. Until it does that, it doesn't get any money. And what if there's an issue with that fridge and they can't sell it, or if they have to sell it cheap? There's all these issues. So typically, if you are a loan providing institution, you don't want a bunch of people out with loans at the same time. And absolutely everybody had loans for absolutely everything. Banks weren't even checking to see if you already had a loan. So you took out a loan for your fridge, and then you took one out for the stove, then you took one out for the car, and you had one out for your home. Pretty soon you have all of these loans and all of these payments, and some people were even taking loans to pay for their other loans. That's, by the way, a really bad idea. The interest will eventually catch up to you, and if you don't know what interest is, you shouldn't be taking loans out in the first place. And so there's just this big debt problem in the United States. People are spending money that's not theirs, not really thinking about the consequences. And by the way, the banks are responsible for this too, because they're just giving loans out. I mean, they're giving away what feels like free money, and people would be dumb not to take from it. Another societal revolution is a large middle class. These are people that don't have to work 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. These are people that work from 9 to 5, 9 to 6. We aren't quite to the 40-hour work week, but we're getting there. They're people that typically they could afford for their wives to stay home. They would have several children. All right, this is the American middle class. Now, that doesn't really exist in the same form as it does today, but that's starting to really take shape in the 1920s. Another reason this middle class class is forming is because as people got wealthier and wealthier and more businesses opened up in the big cities, people were leaving farm country and they were moving into the cities. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One of the big ones is because the price of agricultural goods was going down and the ability of farms to collect those goods was going up. Think about huge tractors and combines and harvesters that farmers use nowadays. These technologies are just starting in the 1920s, but a guy with a combine can harvest field after field after field, where a guy with a scythe would struggle to do just one. So we see a lot of these children of these farmers moving into the cities. There's nothing for them to do. The farm is too efficient, but there's jobs in the cities. There's lots of jobs. So we have middle class people pouring into the cities, big cities. We have more disposable income. People don't need to spend every dollar they make just to survive. They've got spare money. And this is one of the things that they're doing with their money. They're borrowing those loans and buying nice things because you do need some money, right? Even these banks made you have some of the money yourself. Usually needed a down payment of some sort to show that you had some skin in the game. Because if you borrow the money and then you get the fridge and you're like, I don't like this fridge, then you can just default on the loan. And what has the bank done? It basically bought the fridge and it didn't want the fridge, right? That's kind of the idea. So if you put a down payment, you lose some money if the bank takes that item. That's kind of the idea. So there's all this disposable income. There's buying, purchasing. That's good for the economy. Because if you're making fridges, if you're making cars, if you're making toasters, if you're making stoves, people are buying and you are in business. Everything's good because you're in business, you've got money, you go spend that on the economy, and we can see we're in a great spiral. We're going up and up and up and up, except in October of 1929, we have an economic lurch, and not in the production. In fact, most Americans weren't affected by the stock market crash of 1929. But the problem is that stock market crash is going to bring almost everything down with it. It's the beginning of a period that we commonly talk about as the Great Depression, and we will talk more about that crash in detail in the next lecture. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Again, I encourage you, if you've never looked up the Roaring Twenties, look it up. If you've never listened to some jazz music, that would be a great thing to do. Maybe while you're working on other homework or something like that, while you're doing a math problem, listen to some jazz music just to get a feel for it, okay? So next time we'll be talking about the crash that started the Great Depression.